The paper will not lie flat. It curls at the edges like a leaf that heard bad news. A red stamp stares back from the corner, then stares again from the same corner, as if time lost its grip and pressed the seal twice. You can almost smell the iron in the ink, can you not? The room is still. Even cicadas outside the Gideon County Archive hush as if their own wings have become a kind of witness. They call it a manumission certificate, creased and handled, stamped twice where once should have been enough. The top line reads, Willow Bend, Brazos River Country. A date in June, then the same date again, not overprinted, but beside itself like a shadow. A clerk had to write this twice, or someone wanted two truths to exist at once. Hold it to the window and you see another life trapped inside the fibers. A freeborn girl named Eliza May Carver, noted as free since birth by a mother who saved coins and paper like they were keys. The handwriting steadies, then trembles on one word, free. The page seems to breathe when you say it aloud. Papers can behave like doors. Keys turn, hinges whisper. Some doors open neat and polite. Others learn to close themselves. In Willow Bend, the pantry door of the old courthouse swings shut on its own every day at 4 in the afternoon, as if it knows when the sun abandons the west wall. People say that is when the river begins to listen. The stamp is a circle with a sawtooth rim. Whoever pressed it down meant to end questions. Instead, the waxy red left a twin, a second seal that should not exist. A county bookkeeper turns the page and his mouth tightens. 2 seals mean 2 stories. 2 stories mean a debt that cannot balance. Outside weather gathers itself without a cloud to show for it. The air tastes like iron filings and cane syrup. The old folks talk about a night when a dry cypress split clean down its spine on the Brazos, and no lightning was near. They say an overseer walked into that night and did not walk back. They say the river kept his ledger. This story will speak of kidnapping and racialized injustice. We will keep our gaze steady and spare you the worst. We will talk about papers, fees, forged names, and the doors those tricks force open. We will talk about what it costs to be free twice. Here is how the paper trail begins to tangle. A ferryman keeps a pocketbook of chits, each with a number, and the hour a skiff slid out, one number appears more than it should. The same line of scrawl, the same hurried hand. 47. If you look again, you will notice 47 blinking at you from 2 different days. On a nail in the archive hangs a little brass tag, oval, smoothed by fingertips. Stamped letters read EC or maybe FC in tired light. That is the trouble. The tag has a twin in a box down the shelf, same shape, wrong initials. Duplicate tags move like little lies with their own feet. Brands are supposed to be permanent marks upon a thing, a claim that will not wash away. But here in Gideon, and across the county line, toward Elkhorn, a brand shows up misspelled. Gideon on one receipt, Gideon on another. The same crooked serif drawn by a man who did not care which side of the river he was on, as long as the fee was paid. We have allies already on these shelves. A church seamstress who writes on the thin edge of paper and stitches her message into a hem. A black Union veteran who walks with a cane and counts patrol routes like a clock. A teacher's notebook full of names that were not meant to live on paper. A photographer's assistant who keeps a private ledger beside the public one. A county bookkeeper who reads columns like confessions. The certificate says Eliza May was born free in Willow Bend, under a roof that smelled of soap root and clean water. Her mother kept the certificate folded tight in a tin, then tucked the tin behind a pantry panel that did not quite match the others. Doors again. Boards that can choose which side of truth to show. One morning, the tin was gone, and the panel hung a breath open. The floor held 3 new prints in the flour dust, the kind left by hard boots that have learned to move quiet. Patrollers say they came to check papers for safety. Their faces say something else. Forged pretext has a smell like hemp rope and bitter ink. At noon, the cicadas fell silent and did not resume. The ferryman remembers that still hour because no wind moved his hat ribbon, and yet the skiff tugged hard at its rope, as if a current below had changed its mind. He wrote 47 again in his book and did not know why his hand did it twice. We will follow the paper where it wants to lead, into ledgers that do not balance and rooms where doors misbehave. We will walk the river path where the cypress split and listen for the name the water kept. Willow Bend woke early, the river making its slow sound against the pilings as if it were turning in sleep. Eliza Macabre was 16 and free by paper and by breath, a girl who could recite the lines on that certificate the way others recited hymns. Her mother, Ruth, ironed the same dress each Sunday, set the tin with the paper behind the pantry board that never sat flush, and told Eliza May to treat doors like choices. The kitchen smelled of soap root and corn mush and the good ink Ruth bought dear from the clerk who liked to talk about his hand. On a Tuesday in August, the patrollers came with voices smooth as lamp oil. They spoke of a census, a registration, a check of names for safety, and they asked for the paper. Ruth fetched the tin and felt the lightness in her palm, a feather where weight should be. The pantry board sat wrong by a finger width. Flour dust kept the story of two unfamiliar boot prints, one toe dragging as if the wearer favored a bad knee. A man with a holster full of quills shook his head at the creased certificate and said it would have to be examined at the courthouse for confirmation. He smiled when he said confirmation, and did not smile with his eyes. Another man stood in the doorway and did not move aside when Ruth tried to step between her daughter and the air outside. At the courthouse, the room smelled of hemp twine and warm iron from the stove they kept hot to soften seals. The clerk who had sold Ruth that good ink blinked and would not meet her gaze. The first stamp on the certificate looked true as sunrise. The second stamp looked tired at the edges, as if the seal had been pressed by a hand that had already decided. The clerk mumbled about a fee, a small one, a formality, and his pen scratched a note that had too many loops in the tail. By noon, the paper was not in Ruth's hand. A receipt here, a promise there, a request that she return in the morning. Eliza May sat on a bench and stared at a nail head in the floor, as if she could fix the world by willing that nail to shine. When the keels bumped the dock at 4, the ferryman glanced in, because he always glanced in on courthouse days. He saw a girl with calm eyes and a mother with a jaw set like a lock. Night came, and with it a rumor that the county had a new rule for verification, a temporary thing that would protect everyone. The rumor walked in boots. Patrollers who had said they were friends of order said they would escort Eliza May to a holding room for her safety. Ruth's breath began to whistle. She followed, and so did the clerk with the too many loops. The holding room had no window and a door with a bolt worn shiny by other hands. Ruth pushed inside behind them and touched her daughter's shoulder. The patroller with the bad knee watched the way her fingers made a prayer on the fabric. He dropped his gaze and said the night would be brief. It was not brief for Ruth. At first light, the door swung open with a scrape like a throat cleared. The room was empty except for a brass oval tag on the bench, stamped EC or FC, depending on where the light struck. A guard said the girl had been taken to Elkhorn for further questions. He said it quickly and did not look at the bolt that still shone with heat where it had been worked. The hallway tasted of smoke and ink. Out on the river, fog slid in sheets, and the ferryman wrote 47 in his pocketbook, even though he had not yet ferried a soul. His hand moved on its own. Then he looked out at the gray path between banks and thought of how numbers can lead you, even when you do not know why. The smell of iron under the bridge made him think of the cypress that groaned in dry weather. Ruth stood on the courthouse steps and held air where her daughter should be. She had saved everything right, every fee, every seal, every receipt, and still the door had closed. She watched a skiff pull out and could not make out the face under the hat on the front bench. Somewhere a bell rang once, not the hour, not the half, The sound hung a moment too long, like a question that no one wanted to answer. The trader who came through Elkhorn in September kept a receipt book that smelled like damp leather and vinegar. He wrote in it with ink that spread outward, in little starbursts, blooming like bruises across the cheap paper. On one page, under the misspelled mark Gideon, he scribbled a name that was not quite Eliza May. Liza Carr, age written as a guess, status noted as unclear. The trader did not like unclear, but unclear could be profitable. Josiah Lark, the ferryman, handled rope and time the way a surgeon handles his tools. He remembered faces and hats and the way fear tries to make itself small. He watched a group board near dusk. A man with quills, a trader with vinegar ink on his fingers, and a girl who did not spill a tear. He punched Chit 47 and tied the stub around his thumb, a habit that helped him remember which numbers mattered. Sister Naomi Price set needles through cloth at the Church of the Crossing, where light came through blue glass like water. She stitched hems for those who came to pray, and for those who could not risk being seen. When the trader asked for her stiffest thread to mend a skirt that had torn on a wagon plank, Naomi lifted the fabric and let her fingers read the weave. She slipped a narrow strip of paper along the hem, and on it she wrote 3 words at a time: "Pantry board yields." A young man named Isaiah Bell stood outside the church with his arm in a sling from a drill mishap at the Union Post downriver. He had not yet marched east, but his mind already marched in straight lines through patrol routes, through the places where men with badges like to light pipes. He watched the trader laugh at something and mark a page with a wet thumb. Isaiah did not laugh. He counted steps and shadows instead. In town, Jonah Reed polished lenses in a photographer's tent that smelled of tin, egg white, and burnt sugar from the collodion. The trader pushed a boy forward for a tintype and asked that the brass tag be visible because buyers like evidence. Jonah noticed the tag and the initials. He saw the mismatch between tag and receipt, EC against LC. He took an extra plate and tucked it into a wooden sleeve that did not belong to the tent at all. Night came on like a curtain, and the ferryman made his last crossing at 8. The river pushed against the boat as if it had questions too. Josiah tied fast to the willow bend side and flipped open his book to add one more line. 47 again. Last trip, wrong direction, time not right. He stared at the double, then closed the book and set his palm on the wood, as if to calm a horse. Ruth waited at the pantry board that sat. Wrong by a breath, she laid her hand on the seam and felt the warmth of the wall, the way a body holds heat after it leaves a room. She did not sleep. She listened for any sound from the courthouse and kept hearing only the bell that would not ring the hour properly anymore. She told herself that in the morning, the clerk would bring the paper and the girl back in the same breath. The morning did not bring what she asked for. It brought a receipt from Elkhorn with a misspelled brand and a line for fee that did not equal the sum at the bottom. Naomi carried a bundle of mended clothes all the way to Willow Bend. She left one skirt heavier than it had been when it came in, and she did not look back at the door that learned to close on its own at 4. Remember that brass tag with the wrong initials. It will glint again where it should not, and a ledger will blink in surprise when the light hits it. Ruth made a petition at the courthouse that winter, a careful plea laid out like bread on the table. She spoke of birth in Willow Bend, of the midwife who stood witness, of the original stamp pressed sure on the certificate. The clerk listened with a mouth as thin as a ruler and said the petition would be reviewed by the county attorney. He said reviewed and slid the paper under a stack where documents went to grow old. Across the river, names turned into numbers. Liza Carr became L. Carr on a bill of sale, then Ellie on a ration line, then a chalk mark on a wall where entries waited for ink. The trader transferred her to a ranch outside Elkhorn where cotton ginned dull and fast under the hand of Thatcher Vance, an overseer who called himself a manager of order. He had a ledger that lined up like marching men. He loved a column that ended in a clean zero. Thatcher Vance was a man who believed that cruelty delivered on schedule was not cruelty at all, but a form of discipline. He walked the rows with a book at his hip and a watch that he wound twice a day. He corrected names the way he corrected figures, with a line through and a rewrite, and he did not care if the letters he made were misshapen. Gideon, Gideon, Giddon. Whatever the hand produced was enough as long as it matched his count. He insisted on tags for all, brass oval, stamped at the smith with initials that he claimed helped with inventory. When the new smith asked which initials for Liza Carr, Thatcher waved his hand and said, "L.C." The smith squinted at the paper and saw a faint E that looked like a ghost under the L. He cut 2 tags to be sure and stamped one EC and one LC, planning to ask later. One got fixed to the girl's dress with a bent pin. The other found its way into a pocket Jonah Reed had sewn to hold what should not be lost. Thatcher also ordered a brand to mark crate sides and bale ties so he could prove origin in any dispute. He sent a note to the ironmonger and got back a steel form with Gideon carved backward. The first time the hot iron kissed wood, the brand came out crooked. Thatcher cursed the ironmonger for bad work. He did not see that his own order had misspelled the name. Ruth crossed county lines with a borrowed mule and her tin now empty. She arrived at the Elkhorn office, where the desk man shrugged and pointed to a paper with the misspelling and said his hands were tied by jurisdiction. He showed her a receipt with an altered name and a new stamp that was sharp as a thorn. He mentioned a fee for appeal. She paid it, because every letter of hope costs something in Gideon County. In the Elkhorn yard. 2 boys leaned a long plank against the smokehouse wall for reasons known only to boys. Eliza noticed the gap that formed where board did not meet board. The gap led into shadow, and the shadow led behind the salt barrels. A small space that a body could not fit through, but a slip of paper could. She stood near it for a moment longer than needed, and listened to the wind come through the crack like it had secrets in it. That night Thatcher wrote 3 numbers in his ledger and tamped a bale with his boot, so the cotton would settle and the total would please him. He made a note to purchase heavier spacers for the press to gain an inch per bale. He told himself that 1 inch across many bales would build a fortune. He did not hear the tiny sound the smokehouse made when wood answered wood along that hidden seam. A seam can be a door if you learn its rhythm. Eliza learned the smokehouse gap, just as the pantry board back home had taught her fingers. On odd days when barrels had been moved, the gap widened by the measure of a spoon handle. On days when salt caked the floor, the wood swelled and shut like a mouth pressed to silence. It became a clock of its own, telling her when to pass and when to wait. Sister Naomi came with mended shirts for the ranch hands and a bag of old hymnals that the church could spare. She slipped 2 needles into the binding of one thin book, and between the paper and the cloth, she slid a note. The note did not say much because much was dangerous. It held a date, a time, and an arrow drawn in a single confident stroke. She folded the book bag around the hymnals and asked a boy to carry it where a girl named Ellie could find it. Miss Aurelia Finch, who taught letters in the small room behind the church in Willow Bend, wrote down names that were not expected to be recorded. She kept her chalkboard clean in the open room, but the slate, hidden behind a curtain, held other lists. Eliza May Carver, Freeborn, Mother Ruth Carver, Tin Box, Pantry Board. Aurelia underlined the double stamp twice and wrote in the margin, "Duplicate seal suggests fraud." She had pretty handwriting and a steady wrist. The steadiness gave comfort. Jonah Reed visited the ranch to photograph a pair of mules for a buyer who wanted proof of color and weight. While Thatcher watched from a careful distance, Jonah let his lens drink the yard, the tags, the brand that came out wrong, because the iron was wrong. In his pocket sleeve, he kept the extra plate of a girl with the brass tag that did not match her name. He was young, but he already understood that the public ledger and the private ledger rarely matched, so he kept both. Isaiah Bell came back from the east with a limp and a quiet way of seeing corners where trouble liked to sit. He made a map of patrol routes on brown paper, with grease pencil, and planned for gaps in the pattern, places where a skiff could slide out without earning a whistle blast. He spoke gently when he approached Ruth with the map, because he knew that grief is a door that resists new keys. Thatcher Vance replaced the pantry lock on the main house because he had begun to suspect that things moved when he did not ask them to move. He cut a key with a bone handle and kept it on his belt like a small trophy. He felt order enter him when the key clicked. He wrote in his ledger, "New lock for pantry, inventory tighter." He underlined tighter twice. Under a moon that looked like a fingernail, Eliza slid a paper through the smokehouse seam. The paper walked the wall and fell behind a barrel as planned. A boy with hands small enough to snake through lifted it out and carried it under his shirt to Naomi. The words were few. Pantry board yields. Naomi closed her eyes and pictured Ruth's kitchen, the seam, the tin. She had a destination now and a door that might be willing to open. Do not forget the hymn book that holds 2 needles and a note. It will write again with a different message, just when numbers on a page start to unravel. When numbers do not add, some men shrug, and some men wake at 2 in the morning with a taste of copper on their tongue. Horace Dunn, county bookkeeper, belonged to the second kind. He liked a ledger that marched from left to right like a hymn sung in unison. The day he found a line that refused to balance, he set his tea aside and ran a finger under the ink as if he could feel where it went wrong. The mismatch began with bale counts from Thatcher's ranch. The totals were bright and tidy. The weights were too neat. The spaces Thatcher ordered to gain an inch per bale had done their work too well, and the figures glowed just a little too perfect to be true. Horace wrote a question mark in the margin. Then he wrote another. Then he turned the page and saw the misspelled brand repeated on rail receipts across to Elkhorn and back again, as if a single careless iron had walked the state printing its error. He sent a letter to the railroad clerk, who returned a stack of copies tied in twine. On 2 of the papers the brand came out Gideon, on the others it came out Gideon. The same hand had signed both. The signature had a G that liked to look like a snake. Horace laid the papers out and made himself look at them until his eyes watered. Duplicate marks, wrong spellings, clean zeros. His tea had gone cold. In town, Jonah set his private ledger side by side, with the public one in his mind. A photograph of mules here, a girl with a brass tag there, a receipt with initials that did not match the face in the frame. He had a habit of writing the gift of light under subjects who seemed to resist the camera. Under Eliza, he had written "holds light like a pocket watch." He did not know why the phrase steadied him. Josiah Lark found that his pocketbook had 3 entries for 47 within a single season. The first when the patrollers took a girl to Elkhorn. The second when the same faces came back with a different tag. The third on a night when he ferried a crate with a seal. That looked like it had been pressed twice. He ran his thumb over the edge of the paper and felt a pull, as if the number itself wanted to climb back into his skin. Miss Aurelia Finch walked to Horace Dunn's office with her hidden slate wrapped in cloth. She asked if he would look at the names she had kept and the places where those names fell out of the public record. Horace had no business meeting with a teacher about such things, but he did anyway because his mouth still held that copper taste from 2 perfect numbers. They laid the slate and the copies side by side. The pattern began to declare itself. Thatcher Vance ordered his men to speed the press, to take advantage of dry air that made cotton leap to his touch. He wrote new notes for overtime, not for pay, but for expectations. He marked names he wanted to watch. He noted that a seamstress seemed to appear often with hymnals and asked the gate man to record the times she came and went. He had learned to trust his ledger more than he trusted his own eyes. Horace sealed a letter and wrote on the front, to be opened only at hearing. He had not requested a hearing yet, but he knew he would. He slid the letter into a drawer and locked it. He placed the key in his vest pocket and felt its weight all afternoon. Remember the misspelled brand and the fairy Chit 47. These twins will stand like witnesses when the room gets quiet and a gavel waits to fall. The land turned brittle under a sun that forgot how to blink. The Brazos lowered itself until mud showed like ribs. Cotton burned tinder dry on the plant, and every step threw up dust that tasted like old rope. Bells in Willow Bend tolled noon at 10 one day, and at 1 the next, as if even time had been moved a little off-center. Ranch hands walked to the well and found the water tasting of limestone and something else. Thatcher had ordered the well limed heavier to keep the buckets clear. He wrote it down like any other note. Well treated, cleanliness improved, fewer complaints. Men drank, then held their stomachs with puzzled faces and went back to work because what else was there to do? Naomi stood in her doorway and watched laundry steam without boiling. That is how hot it was. She pressed a hand to her sewing table and felt heat climb up through the wood. She prayed, not the loud kind, but the kind that slides along the floor and hides in corners. Then she took up her needles and threaded a new message that was shorter than fear. 3 nights, river low, wait for Bell. Isaiah Bell walked the levee after sundown and listened for the cypress groan. Trees do talk. Some whisper like paper. Some complain like hinges. The big one near the ferry made a sound like a book binding stretched past its comfort. Isaiah marked the sound in his head under the same heading where he kept patrol times. He had begun to see the river itself as a ledger. Thatcher Vance purchased heavy spacers, iron bars that slid into the press like the bones of a mechanical rib cage. He wrote the order number down. He did not write down the warning the salesman gave him. The press had a limit. Everyone knows. Thatcher believed limits belonged to men who lacked vision. He weighed the chance of failure against the balance of his columns and tilted the scale with his pen. In Willow Bend, the courthouse door refused to stay open in the heat. It kept closing with a slow private motion, as if the building finally wanted privacy from the lies that had walked its floor. Ruth sat in the hall with her back to the cool wall and traced the grain of the wood with her finger. She thought she heard someone call her name, in a voice like a person who had walked a long way to find her. Josiah cleaned his oar handles and trimmed a new rope end with a blade he had sharpened on river stones. He looked at the point where the cypress turned dark when water rose. He did not like how low the light hung. He did not like that his bones felt the coming of something without the help of clouds. He fixed another 47 chit to his thumb, only to feel what the number wanted to say. It said, soon. The plan was plain on paper and complicated in air. 3 nights from Naomi's note, at 3:17 in the morning, Eliza would step through the smokehouse seam and cross the yard behind 2 men carrying a crate of bent bale ties. Isaiah would be at the fence where the dry cane threw a shadow heavy enough to hide a breath. Josiah would be at the skiff with his oars tipped in cloth to keep them from knocking sound off the dock. Aurelia had folded Ruth's duplicate stamp into a hymn page and tucked it inside her coat. The night had the stillness of glass. The bell in Willow Bend stuttered once at an hour that belonged to foxes. Eliza pressed her body to the wall and counted in her head the way she used to count stitches. The gap let her through. Salt brushed her arm, a cold kiss. She ran bent and low and felt the press shed heat like an animal sleeping too hard. By the fence, Isaiah lifted the bottom slat and let Eliza slide under. He noted the patrol light 2 fields over and said, now. They moved like a sentence crossing a page. Josiah stood with the rope coil in his hand and the skiff already yawed away from shore to cut time. Eliza set 1 foot in the boat and felt the river make a small sound as if it were starting to speak. A shout came from the yard. Not loud, not a whistle. A startled human sound from a guard who had been watching the wrong corner and saw movement where there should have been only shadow. Isaiah stepped between that sound and Eliza and took a blow meant to knock breath away. He stumbled, not from pain so much as from the old limp catching in the dust. Josiah pulled hard and the skiff lurched, then stopped. The rope had snagged on an old iron spike at the dock where the planks had shifted. He jerked and the knot held as if a hand below had reached up to grip it. He dropped to his knees and worked the twist with his teeth and fingers like a man freeing a trapped animal. Seconds expand on the river at night. Each is its own room. Thatcher Vance came out of the press house with his watch in his palm, furious that the clock inside him did not match the clock outside. He saw figures at the dock and raised his arm to signal the whistle man. The man did not blow. He was watching the press floor, where a spacer bar had slid an inch from its hold and made a sound like a bad prayer. Jonah Reed, who had come on a hunch to the edge of the ranch with his camera wrapped in a towel, saw the skiff jerk and the patroller raise his hand. He also saw, in the light that came from nowhere in particular, Eliza's face turned toward the river. He tucked his lens under his coat and stepped into the brush to stay out of sight. When a page tore somewhere behind him, he knew whose book and why. Thompson's ledger, the gate book, a line ripped out to remove a time and a name. The rope came free, with a bite to Josiah's thumb. He shoved off and the skiff slid into the low water. A bullet might have whined if this were another kind of tale. In this one, silence did the harm. The skiff slowed by the bar of silt that had risen in the drought. Josiah felt the bottom drag, as if the river did not trust their weight yet. He leaned back and gave the oars what he had saved for an old age he might not get. Isaiah pushed off the dock with his shoulder, then fell to one knee. He had paid a price the way men do when they stand where paper cannot. He smiled anyway because a boat had begun to move, and in that moment, motion was victory enough. He pressed a folded note into Aurelia's palm as she reached to steady him. It held a name none of them had seen yet. Remember that brass tag with the wrong initials. It will surface again. Not on a dress, but on a desk where keys no longer hang from a cruel belt. Papers began to multiply like aftershocks. Horace Dunn opened his drawer and took out the sealed letter he had written to a hearing that did not yet exist. He arranged the receipts with 2 spellings, the ferry chits with the same number, the copy of the petition Ruth had signed with ink paid for by hunger. He sent notices to Elkhorn and to the rail office beyond, and he sent one to a man whose pen sat in the Freedmen's Bureau, 2 towns over. Aurelia reached for chalk and wrote names in a column where all could see, then erased them and wrote them again on the hidden slate, where only those who needed to know were allowed to read. She showed Ruth how the list made a map. She pointed to the pantry board that would one day help a different girl. Doors can learn by watching other doors. Naomi traveled with hemmems heavier than they used to be. She carried a note, stitched along the fold that looked like nothing at all from the outside. The note told Eliza where to wait on the opposite bank if the boat made it through. It also told what to do if it did not, because planning only for one outcome is a luxury Gideon County refused to grant. The instruction was simple. If the skiff could not cross, go to the cypress when it groans and stand under the split. Jonah took his private ledger to Josiah and laid out plates by lamplight. He showed the brass tag from the first crossing, the altered one from the ranch yard, and the face that held light steady even when hands shook around her. He did not show the extra plate he had made the night of the near miss. He needed to keep some things near the heart, until a room with walls could listen. Isaiah took a cane he had not needed for months back into his hand. He walked the patrol route slower, a man leaning into his limp, a man who did not mind being underestimated while he counted steps and watched where guards looked and where they looked away. He had always believed in order, but not the kind that harms. He began to work toward a hearing, not as revenge but as balance, because balance is what a soldier learns to demand from an unlevel world. Thatcher Vance felt the press resist his touch more often. He heard gears make a sound they had not made before, a little scrape that did not belong in numbers. He told himself the drought was to blame for the new sound because dry wood shifts. He wrote in his ledger that maintenance would be performed after harvest, a note that whistled in the wind and did not reach any ears that mattered. The river looked low enough to keep secrets without having to work hard. At night it hummed instead of flowed, and people along the bank could feel the hum in their teeth if they were quiet. A woman standing by the cypress put her palm on the bark and thought she could tell when the inner wood was ready to complain. Ruth learned that her hand knew the tree the way it knew her own hearth. Remember the seamstress note stitched into a hem. The thread will tug at the exact moment a key falls from a belt into water. The nights that do not announce themselves are the ones that change a place. The day had gone like any other, except the heat felt personal and the wind forgot its manners. After dark, the cypress did not just groan. It sighed from the center out, a deep exhale that made birds leap from their sleep and made dogs lift their heads and speak low. Thatcher Vance stayed late at the press because he meant to close his season with a number he could point to at the rail office like an award. He had measured spacers and tightened bands until his hands smelled like hot iron and old grease. The men had gone to their bunks. He stood in the quiet and wound his watch and told himself the hour belonged to him. In the yard, a bale tie snapped with a song like a fiddle string going wrong. The press shivered and settled. Thatcher's eyes went to the gauge. He used the lever to release the load, then used it again to cheat the release into more pressure, because he believed he could outrun physics if his notes were tidy. A spacer shifted, then another. The wooden frame, dry as tinder, flexed and complained in a language that did not respect ink. Down at the dock, Josiah felt the hum through the planks and looked up river by instinct, not by sight. He saw the cypress and the line it made against a sky with no moon. There was a hair of light down low, not on the horizon, but on the water itself, the kind of thin brightness that comes from friction. He put his hands on the oars without meaning to. The cypress split with a sound like a ledger torn down its binding. No lightning, no wind, just the force, locked into wood, giving up its long argument with thirst. The trunk opened itself along an old scar, and a wedge of night became visible through the tree, as if someone had cut a door. The opening faced the river. The river did not rush. It received. Thatcher heard the tree from inside the press house and stepped into the yard with his watch still open. He had a new thought that held his whole attention. If the tree had given way, it might have fallen across the ditch that carried water to the fire barrels. He walked toward the dock because water made the whole math of his operation possible. His boots made no sound for 3 steps. Then the old boards answered with a low complaint. A key fell from his belt and struck the plank. Not loud. A small chime like a button in a dish. It rolled toward the edge and slid off with a neat little motion. Josiah, who was moving without making waves, saw the circle flash once. Thatcher Neal reached the edge just as the circle touched water. He reached down with a hand that had always expected obedience from anything in its grip. The key did not rise. The river kept it. Where his fingers met the surface, the hum rose as if he had laid his palm on a throat. He leaned farther, and the old dock dipped, because weight does what weight does. Planks separated at a seam nobody had noticed in years. A board let go under his heel. The watch fell. The hum grew. Thatcher reached for the watch and missed. He tried to stand, and the dock tipped from a balance it had held through 6 owners and 3 floods. In the press house, the lever returned on its own, to the position it had been meant to hold all along. Bands loosened. Pressure bled. The line of neat numbers on Thatcher's page became irrelevant to the wood and iron that had been overasked. Outside, the split cypress made a quiet new sound, the whisper of 2 sides arranging their new lives. The dock floated an inch, then settled, and then there was only water and a circle spreading where a key had gone. No one saw Thatcher Vance again after that hour. In the morning, Jonah photographed the press that had decided for itself to stop obeying a book. The rails got a shipment with bale ties stamped with the misspelled brand, still looped but marked by stress. On the dock, Josiah found a torn thread snagged on a nail. It was from a hem, blue and sturdy. The hearing took place in a room that smelled of beeswax and old paper, with blinds half down to keep the noon glare from blinding the clerk. Horace Dunn set his sealed letter on the table and broke the wax with a knife. He read aloud the way a man reads his own confession. He showed the duplicate stamp, the receipts with 2 spellings from one hand, the ferry chits with 47 walking across the season like a tired horse. Ruth sat straight and folded her hands so the tremble could not take her. Aurelia placed the hidden slate where the magistrate could see the column of names and the notes about pantry boards and hymn books. She spoke in the measured voice she used with children learning their first letters. Here is what the public record says. Here is what the private record insists must be true. Naomi pulled a skirt from her bag and laid it out like an altar cloth. She unstuck the hem that looked so tidy and let the note slide into the light. Pantry board yields had come true, and more than once. She did not say much. She did not need to. The needle marks were testimony enough. The hem was a way for air to move where air had been barred. Josiah placed his pocketbook on the table. He let the magistrate run a finger across the notches and the ink. He pointed to the trip times for 47 and the way they refused to abide by a single day. He did not cloak his recollection in poetry. He said simply that the river keeps time and so do hands that hold oars. His voice made the numbers human. Jonah leaned into the light so the plates could read. He placed the tintype with the brass tag EC where all could see. Then he set down the second plate with LC and the same face. Faces do not lie the way paper can. He had also brought a plate of the press with bands bit by stress and spacers that had been made to work like bones beyond their design. He did not mention Thatcher's watch. He did not need to. A clerk from Elkhorn, sent by the rail office, stood up and admitted that 2 brands had come through with 2 spellings and 1 payment envelope. He said the word admitted like a man who expects punishment after the word leaves his mouth. The magistrate did not punish him. He wrote the word admitted in a clear hand in the margin of his notes and underlined it twice. Isaiah spoke last. He did not mention limps or nights or the blow he had taken at the dock. He said that he had seen order twisted into an instrument for theft. He described patrol routes that happened to align with the days a certain trader crossed with the same faces under different names. He set down a map and a list of times that intersected too cleanly with fees collected and not recorded. The magistrate looked at Ruth. He looked at Eliza's, name written in 2 forms. He folded the manumission certificate along its old creases and pressed it flat with his palm, the way a man flattens a map before starting a journey. Then he signed the margin with a statement that the double stamp existed because men had tried to make a truth into a lie, and the truth had resisted. He ordered restoration of status and named those who had paid themselves to be examined in a larger court. Outside the window, the bell finally remembered its duty and rang the correct hour by accident or by grace. Naomi let out a breath, so quiet only Aurelia heard it. Josiah looked down at his thumb and saw that the skin had a faint notch where the twine of 47 had sat for weeks. Jonah closed his ledger with a snap not of triumph, but of relief. Isaiah tipped his cane to Ruth and said her daughter's name with care, the free-born name, the one that deserved ink. Eliza took her paper, back the way a farmer takes back a tool that had been borrowed too long. The manumission certificate had softened from being handled, but it still had its bones. She slid it into a new tin with a tighter lid and a cloth wrapped around it to keep the edges from fretting. She held it against her chest without shame, and felt the steady knock of her own heart through the metal. She stood again in Ruth's kitchen, where the pantry board remembered her fingers. The seam accepted her touch and opened a hair, like a friend who only needs to see your face one moment to recognize you forever. She slid 2 maps behind it, one for routes to the ferry when the river ran low, and one for when the river swelled and men posted themselves on high ground. She wrote in a small hand, "Doors teach doors." Aurelia and Naomi and Jonah and Josiah and Isaiah sat together for once in daylight at a table where they could be seen. They looked like 5 corners of a strong shape. Josiah promised to keep 2 books without guilt, one for the county, one for the truth. Naomi began to teach younger hands how to stitch notes so fine they would pass through fire and not be found. Aurelia started a book of names with empty lines at the end of each page to make room for futures that needed space. Eliza chose what to be called in rooms that had tried to erase her. She kept Carver for Ruth and added 2 rivers for herself, because 1 river had taken and 1 had given. Eliza May, 2 rivers. The name sat right in her mouth. She wrote it on the inside lid of the new tin like a quiet oath. Then she gave that tin to the pantry seam until it settled into the wall, as if it had always been there. The ranch that Thatcher had ordered like a clock began to look less certain without his keys on his belt. Men worked as before, but the press had a new sound that meant caution lived there. The well was treated with care instead of lime. The brand iron was recut by a smith who spelled slowly and did not pretend he could rush language. Things did not become perfect. They became possible. Remember the creased manumission certificate stamped twice. It will ride in that tin for years and then step out when a younger pair of hands asks the right question. Decades later, the archive in Willow Bend received a crate that smelled of camphor and cedar. A teacher with gray in her hair and a way of pausing before she touched paper opened it with a knife that had belonged to her grandfather. Inside lay a stack wrapped in cloth. On top rested a tin with a lid that showed the faintest line of a name. Eliza May, 2 rivers. The teacher was named Mariah Finch, kin to Aurelia. She had grown up with the sound of chalk under her pillow. She set the tin down on a table where light fell even and steady. When she lifted the lid, the smell of old iron ink rose as if a room years ago had exhaled and the breath had been waiting. She laid out the certificate with its twin stamp, the fairy chits tied in a little bundle, the seamstress note with needle holes like tiny stars. She found a brass tag, oval, smoothed by fingers, with EC on one face and the faint print of an L on the other side from where someone had pressed too hard, and she knew she was touching a lie that had lost. She found a rail receipt with Gideon scorched into it and a second with Gideon, and she smiled because language had taken a side. She found a ledger page that did not balance and a letter from a man named Horace Dunn, confessing to the relief he felt when ink finally told the same story as breath. Mariah read a line in Eliza's hand that said, "Doors teach doors," and stood in the archive listening to the long building creak. Floorboards do learn. They choose who they wish to carry softly. She turned to the window where the river below made its steady noise and thought of a split cypress that had threatened to fall in her childhood stories and then did. She told herself that trees keep promises too. She closed the tin and looked into the camera on her desk, the one she used to record lessons for people too far to walk. She spoke Eliza May 2 Rivers' full name and let it sit in the air. She invited those who listened to find objects in their own houses that insisted on telling their stories. Brass tags, notes in hems, ledger lines that made no sense until a new light struck them. Tell me where you are watching from. Your ground holds a story too. If you are new, subscribe. If you have been here a while, you already know we do not look away. This has been Tales Never Told. If this story moved you, leave a like to help it reach readers who need it. Share what town or river or road you call home in the comments. And tell us which object spoke the loudest to you, the creased certificate, the brass tag, or the number 47 that refused to behave. Join us for the next investigation, where we follow a church bell that rang at the wrong hour and would not stop ringing until a missing ledger found its way back to the desk that betrayed it. The river remembers. The paper does too.